midnight.
January 11th, which is something that I've reported before, that I've heard from other neighbors, but also January 24th, which is the Saturday before Nancy Guthrie went missing.
In 1999, two Harvard psychologists ran an experiment that quietly shattered everything science thought it understood about the human mind. They gathered volunteers, sat them in front of a screen, and gave them one job. Watch a short video of people passing a basketball and count how many times the players in white shirts make a pass. That is it. Simple, focused, controlled. Most people nailed the count. And then the researchers asked a follow-up question that stopped people cold. Did you see the gorilla? Not a shadow, not a shape in the background. A person in a full gorilla suit walked directly into the center of the frame, stopped, turned, faced the camera, and stood there for 9 full seconds before walking off screen. 9 seconds. Center frame, in plain sight. And roughly half of every volunteer in that study never saw it. Not because they were not paying attention. They were paying complete, locked-in total attention. That was exactly the problem. The researchers, Christopher and Shabri and Daniel Simons, named what they had uncovered inattentional blindness. And what it tells us is something that should genuinely unsettle anyone who has ever trusted their own eyes. The human brain is not a camera. It does not record everything in front of it. It is an editor, a ruthless one. It decides in real time what is relevant to the task at hand, and it does not simply reduce attention to everything else. It eliminates it. Completely. The gorilla did not register because the brain had already committed to counting passes. Anything outside that task did not slow down. It did not blur. It simply ceased to exist in the viewer's experience of that moment. Shabri and Siemens pushed further. They ran new versions of the experiment on subjects who already knew about the gorilla, who had been warned, who were specifically told to watch for it. And here's where the research goes, from fascinating to genuinely frightening. Knowing about one gorilla does not mean you will see the next one. The brain becomes alert for the specific thing it was warned about, and everything else remains subject to the same invisible filtering. You can be fully awake, fully present, actively trying, and still not see what is sitting directly in front of you, because what is sitting directly in front of you has not yet been placed into a category your brain knows how to use. That is not a flaw in how we think. Scientists will tell you it is a feature. It is how the human mind manages a world that throws millions of pieces of sensory information at us every single second. Without that filtering system, we would be paralyzed. The problem is that the same system that keeps us functional can be used against us. And in a quiet residential neighborhood tucked into the Catalina foothills of Tucson, Arizona, it appears that is exactly what happened. This is a true crime documentary about a woman named Nancy Guthrie. She is 84 years old. She has a pacemaker. She requires daily heart medication to survive. And on the night of February 1st, 2026, she was taken from her home on a winding, unlit residential road called Via Entrada, while an entire neighborhood slept around her and their cameras went dark one by one. For 54 days, investigators, journalists, neighbors, and thousands of people across the country who follow this case online looked at the same street, the same footage, the same publicly available evidence. And during those 54 days, 4 separate pieces of information sat in plain sight, seen, documented, published, and invisible to nearly everyone who encountered them. Not hidden, not locked behind a warrant or buried in a classified file. Visible, accessible, out in the open on a street that was under constant media coverage and active federal investigation. This documentary is not a list of things that went wrong. It is an examination of why the human mind, even a trained one, even a desperate one, even one that genuinely wants to find the truth, could look directly at an answer and not recognize it as one. Because the gorilla walked through the frame the entire time. And so did whoever took Nancy Guthrie. Before we talk about what was missed, we have to talk about the place where this happened. Because the geography of Via Entrada is not background detail in this true crime story, it is evidence. Reporter John DePro has been covering the Nancy Guthrie case on the ground in Tucson from the earliest days of the investigation. When asked to describe Via Entrada, the road that winds through and around Nancy's neighborhood, he did not reach for dramatic language. He simply said what it is: a maze at night, no street lights. You cannot read the street signs in the dark. Sit with that for a moment. A residential road in the Catalina foothills of Tucson that becomes functionally unnavigable after dark without prior knowledge of its layout. That is not a minor logistical detail. That is a defining characteristic of this crime scene, because a road that disorients strangers at night is, by definition, a road that requires familiarity to move through with confidence. You cannot wing it on Via Entrada at 2 in the morning. You cannot trust instinct if you've never been there before. Every fork, every unmarked turn, every point where the path splits and the sign you need is swallowed by darkness, those are obstacles that punish people who do not already know the answer before the question appears. Now picture that same road in daylight, nothing unusual. A quiet residential street in the foothills, the kind of road you drive through without registering a single detail because nothing about it asks you to pay attention. No reason to slow down, no reason to look twice, no reason to remember it at all. And that right there is the trap. Not an accident, not a coincidence of geography. A trap. Because what the inattentional blindness research tells us, what Chabris and Simons documented across study after study, is that we do not fail to notice things because they are concealed. We fail to notice them because we have not been given a reason to notice them. The gorilla was not in disguise. It was invisible because the people watching had already committed to a task, and the gorilla did not belong to that task. The brain processed it as irrelevant and moved on before the conscious mind ever had a chance to catch up. A car on Via Entrada on a Saturday morning at 10 in the morning is not a gorilla in a basketball game. It is a car on a residential street. It belongs there. Every single person who drove past it, glanced at it, caught it on the edge of a camera frame, processed it the exact same way. Normal. Expected. Not worth a second look. The brain filed it and moved on. That is not negligence. That is not failure. That is the human mind operating precisely the way it was built to operate, but here's the possibility that this investigation has been quietly circling for weeks. The possibility that changes the entire shape of this case. Someone may have known that. Someone may have chosen the next Saturday morning in a residential road in broad daylight specifically because they understood what the human brain would do with all of it. Specifically because ordinary does not get flagged. Ordinary is the background that the foreground stands against. And if you are patient enough and careful enough, and you understand enough about how people actually perceive the world around them, ordinary never becomes foreground at all. That is the method this documentary will return to again and again. Not recklessness, not desperation, patience, normality. The calculated understanding that the most effective cover in the world is not a disguise. It is fitting so completely into the expected visual landscape of a place that no brain in that environment has any reason to apply a second look. Via Entrada was chosen. That is what investigators believe. Not stumbled upon, not convenient, chosen, and the choosing began weeks before Nancy Guthrie was taken. About 2 weeks after Nancy Guthrie vanished, investigators pushed a canvas request through Ring's Neighbors platform to residents across the Catalina foothills. Local Tucson stations, KFSO and KOLD, confirmed the request. The FBI and Pima County Sheriff's deputies wanted residents to pull their doorbell footage and search it for 2 specific blocks of time. 2 dates, 2 windows. No explanation for either one. The first was January 11th, 3 weeks before the abduction. The requested window ran from 9 in the evening
to midnight.
January 11th, which is something that I've reported before, that I've heard from other neighbors, but also January 24th, which is the Saturday before Nancy Guthrie went missing.
No public statement has ever been issued explaining why that date matters. Investigators have acknowledged their interest in it and said nothing further. In a case where the task force has been deliberate and careful about every single thing it confirms publicly, that silence is not an oversight. When investigators request footage without explaining why they want it, it is because they do not want whoever left that footage to know they are looking. The second date was January 31st, the day before Nancy was taken, morning window 9:30 to 11. And embedded inside that request, almost as a footnote, was a note that a suspicious vehicle had been spotted on Via Entrada around 10 in the morning. No make, no color, no direction of travel, no description of any kind. What investigators communicated through the sheer specificity of requesting a 90-minute window on one road on one morning is that the car mattered. That someone had noticed it in a way they could not fully explain at the time. That it did not quite fit. And that 6 weeks later, the FBI was committing full resources to finding out exactly what it was. Investigative reporter Dave Mack, speaking on Crime Stories with Nancy Grace, laid out what the Bureau was pursuing. Every Ring doorbell camera, every security device with a view of Via Entrada between 10 in the morning and 11:30. He said the vehicle. Was not exactly sure what that means, but it stuck out. and it stuck out during the daytime. That says a lot. He is right. The word suspicious is not an objective description. It is a perceptual judgment. It means someone registered that car as not belonging and still did not know in the moment what to do with that registration. Someone noticed the gorilla. They just did not yet know they were watching a basketball game. Now look at what January 31st actually represents inside the full timeline of this case. At 9:50 that evening, Nancy Guthrie was recorded on her own doorbell camera entering her garage, returning home from dinner at her daughter Annie's house. According to CBS News, citing official sources, her home's doorbell camera disconnected at approximately 1:47 in the morning on February 1st. At around 2:12, one of her home's cameras classified a person as present, but no video footage was recoverable. Her pacemaker application disconnected from her phone. At 2:28 in the morning. 8 minutes later, at 2:36, a Ring camera 2.5 miles away recorded a vehicle moving through a back road that avoids every major intersection out of the neighborhood. 16 hours. 16 hours separate a car on Via Entrada at 10 in the morning from a pacemaker signal lost at 2:28 the following night. 16 hours between a road being studied in daylight and someone moving through it without hesitation, in complete darkness. On an unlit maze of a road that reporters on the ground have described as impossible to navigate without already knowing it. That confidence does not come from luck. It does not come from a first visit. It comes from having already driven that road, from having noted in daylight every turn that becomes invisible after dark, from having done the work long before the night it mattered. Retired NYPD Detective Pat Brosnan reviewed the 2:36 footage with his team. The silhouette, the roofline angle, the profile of the rear quarter glass, the shape of the vertical brake lights. His analysis pointed toward a Kia Soul. That vehicle has not been publicly identified. Whether the Saturday morning car and the 2:36 car are the same vehicle, investigators have not confirmed. What the FBI's 90-minute window on January 31st tells us is that they believe whoever was on that road before dark is connected to what happened after it. And January 11th, 3 weeks earlier, 9 to midnight, sits in the same file without a single word of public explanation. If the theory is reconnaissance, if someone was learning this neighborhood across multiple visits, clocking the patterns, timing the street, identifying which houses had which cameras and how those cameras were angled, then January 11th is not background. It is the beginning. It is the moment 3 weeks before Nancy Guthrie was taken, when the thing that would later become a crime was already underway on Via Entrada, already visible, and invisible to everyone who saw it. Consider what 3 weeks of reconnaissance actually produces. It produces certainty, the kind of operational confidence that eliminates improvisation entirely, the kind that knows before the night arrives which lights will be on and which will be dark, which neighbors walk dogs at 2 in the morning and which are reliably asleep, which camera angles cover which sections of the approach to one specific house on one specific road. The FBI's interest in January 11th, combined with the January 31st morning vehicle, describes something that was not conceived and executed in a week. It describes a planning phase that stretched across an entire month, every step of it conducted in plain sight, during ordinary hours, by what appeared to every brain that processed it to be an ordinary car on an ordinary street. The human mind does not flag ordinary, and whoever understood that built an entire operation around it. Here is a thought experiment. You wake up the morning after a quiet night and you check your Ring camera history the way you do every morning, and you notice a gap, a 2-hour window marked simply as not available. What do you do? In almost every case, nothing. You assume the internet went out. You note it mildly, maybe mention it to whoever is sitting across the breakfast table, and you move on. Because outages happen. They happen constantly and everywhere, and to everyone. The brain takes that information, a gap in footage, routes it to the most statistically probable explanation, and files it. Temporary disruption. Normal, not worth a phone call, not worth mentioning to a neighbor. The gorilla walks through and the brain marks it an uninteresting infrastructure event. This is exactly what happened across the Catalina foothills on the night of February 1st, 2026. News Nation's investigative reporter Brian Anton broke the story on March 6th, more than 30 days after Nancy Guthrie was taken. He had spoken to a neighbor whose Ring camera history showed a gap during the critical hours. The footage was simply not there. He reported it, and then other neighbors confirmed the same thing, camera gaps, footage marked not available, the same window, the same night, multiple houses. Let that land for a moment. Not one home, not a single isolated outage on a single street, multiple homes. The same window, the same night that Nancy Guthrie was taken. When investigators returned to the neighborhood in the early March, the specific question they brought with them was not, "Did you see anything?" It was "Did your internet go out that night?" Residents in 3 homes confirmed to NBC correspondent Liz Kreutz that Pima County deputies were asking exactly that. Officers reportedly told residents that several people had mentioned glitches that night. That phrasing matters enormously. Investigators were not surprised by what they were hearing. They were building a pattern they already suspected existed. And the pattern was that an entire neighborhood's surveillance infrastructure went dark, house by house, in a window that each individual resident experienced as their own private inconvenience, because not one of them had any reason to compare notes with their neighbors. That is the second kind of invisible thing this true crime case keeps producing. Not the detail you miss because you are distracted. The pattern you cannot see because you're only ever holding one piece of it. The mind needs the full picture to identify what it is looking at. Give someone a single frame from the gorilla video, and they will tell you they see a person standing in a hallway. Give them the full video and the gorilla appears. One camera gap is a Tuesday. A dozen camera gaps in the same window on the same night is something that should not be physically possible by accident. Fox News digital reporter Michael Ruiz published a photograph of a damaged utility box positioned around the corner from Nancy Guthrie's home. The Pima County Sheriff's Department confirmed it is actively investigating whether that box is connected to the outages. Retired FBI Special Agent Jennifer Coffindaffer publicly raised the question that investigators were already examining privately. Did someone damage that box before February 1st specifically to blind the neighborhood before they moved? Now look at each confirmed fact in isolation. A damaged utility box around the corner from the victim's home. A series of ring camera gaps across multiple houses on the same night. A woman taken from that same street in that same window. Each one alone is unremarkable. Utility boxes get damaged, cameras go offline, outages happen. The brain processes each of those things individually and files every single one of them as background noise, but together they describe something that has a different name entirely. A damaged box around the corner from the victim's house. Multiple cameras going dark across multiple properties in the same window. A woman gone by morning. Together that is not an outage, that is an operation. A planned deliberate suppression of an entire neighborhood's surveillance infrastructure executed before a crime was committed. And the distinction between those two readings, outage versus operation, is the difference between a case that goes cold and one that cracks open. The FBI released footage on February 10th that showed what appears to be an antenna-like device in the suspect's pocket as he moved across Nancy Guthrie's porch. Criminal defense attorney Joshua Ritter offered a distinction that changes the shape of the entire picture. A Wi-Fi jammer deployed at a single home would not, on its own, produce a neighborhood-wide outage. That would require something far more powerful, far more deliberate, far more prepared. Which opens a reading that is more unsettling than either element alone. The utility box and the device in the suspect's pocket were not the same tool, doing the same job. They were two separate instruments inside a layered plan. One disrupted the neighborhood's infrastructure from the outside. One disrupted the specific camera on Nancy's porch from the inside. Two methods, one outcome. A street with no witnesses and a house with no functioning camera at the moment it mattered most. You do not improvise two methods. You do not arrive at a front door with a jammer in your pocket and spontaneously decide to also damage a utility box around the corner on the same night. You plan them together, because you understand that one method alone may not be enough. That some cameras are hardwired, that some systems store footage locally, that redundancy requires redundancy. That level of operational thinking is not the fingerprint of someone acting out of desperation or impulse. It is the fingerprint of preparation. Extended, patient, detailed preparation by someone who had thought through every layer of the obstacle between them and that front. Doc Warren had already decided how to remove each one before the night they needed to. The cameras went silent. The neighborhood slept. And every resident who found a gap in their history the following morning filed it as background noise, a private inconvenience, a minor annoyance that belonged to them alone. Not gorilla, just static. None of them knew they were all looking at the same thing. On February 10th, 9 days after Nancy Guthrie was reported missing, FBI Director Kash Patel released doorbell camera footage recovered from her Nest device. The Bureau had worked directly with Google to pull it from residual data stored in back-end systems. The physical camera itself was missing from the property. Taken. Its whereabouts still unaccounted for. What that footage showed was immediately absorbed into the national conversation in the way major evidence releases always are. The backpack, the holster, the gloves, the mask, the deliberate, unhurried movement across a lit and surveilled porch. Every detail analyzed across hundreds of articles, YouTube documentaries, true crime podcasts, and cable news segments. Experts weighed in. Former investigators weighed in. The public weighed in. The footage was picked apart frame by frame across every platform that covers cases like this one. And inside that avalanche of analysis, in nearly every single piece published about the footage, one sentence appeared, was noted, and was passed over. The suspect was holding a small flashlight in his mouth, not in his hand, not clipped to his gear, between his teeth, pointing forward, hands free. Held there while both hands were occupied at the camera on Nancy Guthrie's front door. That detail was in the FBI footage from the first day it was released. It appeared in the AP Wire story that ran across hundreds of outlets simultaneously. It showed up in article after article after article, and in almost every single case it occupied one sentence, and then the writer moved on to the backpack, or the holster, or the height estimate. The flashlight was noted. It was filed. And it became invisible in the most precise sense this true crime documentary has been building toward. It was seen and not understood and passed over because nobody had yet given it a category. Nobody had yet built the frame that transforms a single observed detail into a piece of evidence with weight and direction. That frame came from an unlikely place. Former homicide detective and police commander David Lanes, based in Lexington, Kentucky, was among the first analysts to name what he was looking at. He said not many people instinctively hold a flashlight in their mouth, but those who work in the trades might. An electrician, a plumber. He called it a small thing, but he said down the road it could be something. That statement is the cognitive act that inattentional blindness research tells us must happen before invisible things can be seen. Lanes was not simply noting that a flashlight was present in the footage. He was identifying what kind of person holds a flashlight that specific way and placing that behavior inside the frame of a specific population. And once that frame exists, the single sentence that was invisible across 100 articles becomes the sentence a reader cannot stop turning over. Because this is not a generic behavior. It is not something learned in a classroom or picked up from a YouTube video or absorbed from watching someone else do it at once. It is learned the way all deep physical habits are learned, through years of repetition in a specific context. An electrician working inside a wall panel has both hands inside the cavity and no surface nearby to set anything down on. A plumber threading pipe beneath a floor joist is in the exact same position. An HVAC technician, a rough carpenter, a general contractor who has spent thousands of hours in tight spaces with no overhead lighting and both hands committed to the work. They all learn it early and they carry it permanently. The flashlight goes between the teeth. The hands stay free. The work continues. That posture is so specific to the trades that a retired homicide detective in Kentucky identified it from footage shot in Arizona within days of its public release and published his analysis through the AP Wire, where it reached every major news outlet in the country simultaneously. The detail was out in the open. The frame was available. And for 6 weeks the sentence went largely unremarked across thousands of articles and comment threads and documentary breakdowns, because the reader did not yet have a reason to stop on it. Former FBI profiler Clint Van Zandt reviewed the full porch footage and said there was a tremendous amount of information that this individual left behind. He was not being rhetorical. The footage under behavioral analysis carries a density of identifiable traits: the gait, the decision-making sequence, the choice to remove a plant rather than simply block the lens and walk away, the composure of movement across a lit and surveilled porch belonging to a home he had no right to be at. All of it contributes to a forensic behavioral profile that trained analysts can work with. But the flashlight is different from all of those things. The other behavioral markers speak to planning and composure and decision-making in the moment. The flashlight speaks to a physical history, to a body that learned something specific over years of working in conditions where putting down the light was not an option. That is not a behavioral choice made on a porch in the early hours of February 1st. That is a habit so deeply embedded it did not require a conscious decision at all. It simply happened. The hands were occupied, the light went in the mouth, the body did what it has always done. That kind of automatic physical response does not come from one profession, but it does come from a defined and identifiable group of them, and investigators appear to have been building toward exactly that conclusion. On separate returns to the Catalina Foothills neighborhood, investigators asked a neighbor for the names of construction workers at a nearby home that was under active renovation. They also asked about a former neighbor who had moved out of the area shortly before Nancy disappeared. Both lines of inquiry point toward the same underlying question. Was there someone with legitimate professional access to these streets and these properties in the weeks and months before February 1st? Think about what professional access actually provides in a neighborhood like this one. An electrician contracted for work in the Catalina Foothills knows where the utility infrastructure is, because navigating utility infrastructure is the job. A contractor working a new build 2 blocks from Nancy's house knows Via Entrada in daylight, because he drove it every working morning for however long that job lasted. He knows which way to turn at the fork where the sign goes. Dark. Not because he memorized it, because his body memorized it for him. A tradesperson with repeat access to several properties on the same street knows the layout of that neighborhood the way only someone with a physical reason to be there can know it, not from memory alone, from the legs, from the hands, from the kind of absorbed knowledge that does not require thinking because it was deposited long before the night it was needed. But the professional access theory runs deeper than navigation alone. A tradesperson working legitimately in a neighborhood carries something no casual observer and no stranger can replicate. A reason to be there that no one questions. A truck parked on Via Entrada for 3 hours while an electrician works a nearby job is not suspicious. It is expected. It is background. Nobody runs the plate. Nobody calls in a description. Nobody thinks twice about a person in work clothes walking the perimeter of a neighboring property to check on something. Professional context provides exactly what inattentional blindness research identifies as a categorical shield. The brain registers tradesperson working, files it as not relevant, and moves on before the conscious mind ever engages. If someone with that kind of access used it to conduct reconnaissance across multiple visits, to learn the road, to note the camera placements, to identify the utility infrastructure, to map every obstacle between the street and Nancy Guthrie's front door, they did all of it in full view of everyone on that street, visible to every passing car, every neighbor checking a ring notification, every delivery driver moving through. Invisible to all of them because the category assigned to a person with a work truck and a professional reason to be present is not a threat. It is furniture. It is background. It is the wallpaper the brain registers once and never looks at again. And on a front porch in the early hours of February 1st, with both hands occupied at a doorbell camera and a need for light that could not wait, he did what his body has always done. The flashlight went between the teeth. That detail was in the footage from day one. 1 sentence, 100 articles, 6 weeks. The frame was available in the entire time. Nobody stopped. Day 50. March 22nd, 2026. 50 days since Nancy Guthrie was taken. The investigation had produced no public arrest, no named suspect, no confirmed identity for the figure captured on her porch in the early hours of February 1st. The Guthrie family had issued a new statement urging Tucson residents to search their memories, their footage, their text messages, their conversations. Someone knows something. And then the statement added a line that stopped people who had been following this case from the beginning. It is possible that a member of this community has information they do not even realize is significant. That language do not even realize is the thesis of inattentional blindness applied directly to a live federal investigation. It is not an accusation. It is not frustration. It is an acknowledgement from the people closest to this case of how human perception actually operates. Not that someone is deliberately withholding the truth, that someone is carrying it without knowing they have it. On that same day, a YouTube content creator known as Dad's Gone Live was on Via Entrada, doing what he had been doing for weeks. Watching, filming, staying present on a street that the rest of the media had largely begun to cycle away from. And he noticed something that had been there long enough to show weathering from the Arizona sun. Yellow signs, handwritten, posted near Nancy Guthrie's home. He stopped. He read them. And then he called the police. Pima County Sheriff's detectives arrived, examined the signs, and removed one as evidence. The signs read, Guthrie, and Carol Shemek. Below that, Yavapai Sheriff's Department. Below that, Lemons Road State Fire. And on a second sign, a license, plate number, CBD 2273. Now ask the inattentional blindness question directly. Why did nobody call this in before day 50? Why did those signs stand on a public street under active federal investigation in a neighborhood that had been under constant national media coverage for 7 weeks and go unread by every neighbor, every reporter, every investigator who walked or drove past them? The answer is categorization. For 50 days, yellow objects placed near Nancy Guthrie's home had been arriving steadily. Flowers, candles, notes, banners, handmade signs from community members and grieving strangers who had followed the case from across the country. The visual category for yellow objects near that house was established early and fixed firmly. The brain-passing yellow signs near that memorial filed them without hesitation into the already existing category. Community expression, grief, background, not relevant to the investigation, not worth slowing down for. The gorilla walked through in a yellow suit for 50 days straight until one person stopped the basketball count and actually read the words. What those words said changed the shape of the day entirely. Carol Shemek, according to public records and community accounts that surfaced after the signs were collected, died on January 1st, 2020. She lived in Chino Valley, Arizona, Yavapai County. She was 74 years old. She ran a rock and jewelry shop and was known locally for activism around water rights disputes in her rural community. Chino Valley sits approximately 224 miles northwest of Tucson, a 3.5-hour drive. Yavapai County lies to the north of Pima County, in a completely separate region of Arizona. The institutional names written alongside her name on those signs, Yavapai Sheriff's Department and Lemons Road State Fire, are references to that region. Not to Tucson, not to Pima County, not to anything connected to Nancy Guthrie's neighborhood on any publicly documented level. What followed? Shemek's death in certain community discussions was a claim, unverified, carrying no official ruling, unsupported by any open investigation, that her death was not natural, that she had been harmed, that those responsible were connected to the very institutions whose names now appeared in black marker on yellow paper outside the home of an active federal kidnapping victim, 50 days into one of the highest profile missing persons investigations in the country. That claim's an allegation. It is not a finding. There is no homicide investigation. There is no ruling of foul play attached to Carol Shemek's death in any official record. What exists is a sign, placed on a street under active federal investigation, bearing a dead woman's name alongside the name of a missing woman, collected by Pima County detectives on day 50 and placed into an evidence bag. And that evidence collection is itself a piece of information. Here's why that matters. Every object at a crime scene that investigators do not collect represents a professional judgment. A trained investigator concluding that a particular item does not rise to the threshold of relevance. When an item is collected, bagged, and removed from the scene, the opposite judgment has been made. Someone standing on that street on day 50 looked at handwritten names from Yavapai County alongside references to a sheriff's department and a fire agency 224 miles from where they were standing and made a deliberate decision. This needs to go to the lab. Investigators do not collect items out of caution. They collect items because a trained professional has determined that the object may carry information relevant to the crime being investigated. That decision is not casual, it is not routine. It is a conclusion reached by someone whose entire professional existence is built around distinguishing signal from noise. Those signs were signal. And the license plate number written on the second sign, CBD2273, is the most immediately actionable piece of information this entire cluster of evidence is produced. A real plate number on a real vehicle connects directly to a real registered owner. It means investigators can identify who drove to Nancy Guthrie Street, stood in front of her home, wrote those names in marker, or posted those signs, and walked away. And it means they can find out what that person knows, or believes they know, about what happened on February 1st. That person is one of three things. Someone holding a genuine connection between Carol Shemek's death and Nancy Guthrie's disappearance that no investigator has yet identified or mapped. Someone operating from a deep personal grievance against institutions they believe wronged them, who attached that grievance to the highest profile crime in Tucson in years, because it was the most visible surface available. Or the possibility that this documentary will not dismiss someone who has real information about Nancy Guthrie who does not trust law enforcement enough to call a tip line, and who chose the only form of communication that felt safe. A handwritten name on a public street outside a house the entire country was watching. All three of those possibilities lead to a conversation that investigators need to have. Someone placed those signs. They stood in the Arizona sun long enough to weather. They were visible from the road to every person who drove or walked past them for however many days they stood there. Every neighbor, every reporter, every investigator canvassing the street, every camera crew setting up a shot in front of that house, every community member leaving flowers at the memorial. Every single one of them filed yellow objects near a memorial as background. Not gorilla, just yellow paper in the Arizona heat. There's a version of this true crime documentary that is simply a list. The car on Via Entrada at 10 in the morning on January 31st. The neighborhood-wide camera outages on the night of February 1st. No, you see a flashlight held between the teeth of a suspect on a front porch. The yellow signs bearing Carol Shimmick's name that stood unread for 50 days on a street under national media coverage and active federal investigation. That list exists. You can find it assembled in various orders across dozens of articles and YouTube videos and true crime summaries and podcast episodes. The same 4 details, the same quotes attached. Available on a dozen different platforms for anyone who wants them. This documentary has not been that list. This documentary has been about one thing. Why those 4 details were visible for days and weeks, and in one case more than a month before anyone gave them the weight they deserved. Why the human mind, even a trained one, even a desperate one, even one that genuinely and completely wants to find the truth, can look directly at an answer and not recognize it as one. And the answer, as research on human cognition has documented since 1999, is not incompetence. It is not negligence. It is not a failure of effort or care or commitment. It is the way the mind operates when it has not yet been given a frame. When the organizing principle that transforms individual observations into connected evidence has not yet been constructed. Without the frame, the brain does exactly what it was built to do. It files each thing as unrelated, normal, background, and moves on. Chabris and Simons found that the volunteers who failed to see the gorilla were not less attentive or less intelligent or less observant than the ones who noticed it. They were simply doing the task they had been assigned the way the human brain is built to do every task. Efficiently, categorically, with everything outside the task scope processed as background and released. The failure to see is not a flaw in those people. It is a feature of every person, one that makes us functional in a world that throws overwhelming sensory information at us every waking second of every day, and one that can be studied, understood, and deliberately used by someone patient enough to build an operation around it. What makes this case different from most prolonged missing persons investigations is that the unreached evidence does not appear to be buried. It has not required warrants to surface. It has not needed forensic breakthroughs to uncover. Every detail this documentary has examined was visible to people who were physically present at the time, or accessible in footage that was already public, or sitting inside an article that had already been written and widely distributed. The car was seen in real time. The outages were experienced in real time by the people they happened to. The flashlight was published in the FBI's own evidence release. The sign stood on a public street in a neighborhood under constant coverage. None of it was locked away. What was locked was the frame. And that is the particular cruelty of inattentional blindness as an investigative obstacle. It does not hide evidence. It miscategorizes it. And an incorrect categorization is far harder to reverse than concealment, because concealed things can be uncovered once you know they exist. Incorrectly categorized things require someone to look back at what they already saw and recognize that they were looking at the wrong thing the entire time. That is a harder cognitive act than discovery. It requires the observer to first accept that their initial perception was wrong, and then rebuild the scene from scratch using a frame that did not exist when they first encountered it. For 54 days, investigators, journalists, neighbors, and hundreds of thousands of people following this case looked at Nancy Guthrie's street. They did exactly what they should have been doing. Working the immediate evidence, processing forensics, running leads, pursuing every confirmed thread available to them. And around the periphery of that task, 4 things waited. A car in broad daylight on a maze-like road, 16 hours before a woman was taken in complete darkness. A neighborhood that lost its digital eyes one house at a time in the exact window it needed the most, with each resident certain the problem belonged only to them. One sentence in 100 articles about a man who holds a flashlight between his teeth the way people do when years of working in tight spaces with both hands occupied has made it automatic. And yellow signs neared a grief memorial that nobody read until day 50. Every one of those things was there. Every one of them was seen. Every one of them was invisible. Not because they were hidden, because the frame for seeing them had not yet been built. This documentary is that frame. Nancy Guthrie has been missing for 54 days. She is 84 years old. She has a pacemaker and requires daily heart medication to survive. Her family is offering $1 million for information that leads to her safe return, or to an arrest in this case. If you were on Via Entrada on the morning of January 31st and a vehicle caught your attention in a way you could not fully explain, even if you dismissed it in the moment, even if you told yourself it was nothing, call 1-800-CALL-FBI or submit your tip directly at tips.fbi.gov. The FBI field office is still actively seeking footage from that specific 90-minute window. If your home camera showed a gap on the night of February 1st that you filed as a routine outage and never reported, investigators want to know about it. If you have had construction or trade workers on your property anywhere in the Catalina foothills in the months leading up to February 2026, that information may matter more than you realize. If you drove past those yellow signs before day 50 and did not stop to read them, go back to the memory now and ask yourself what they said. The Pima County Sheriff's Department can be reached at 5203-5149. Anonymous tips go through 88-CRIME at 52-088-27463. The Guthrie family said it plainly, and they said it publicly. Someone in this community holds the key to finding resolution in this case. They also said that person may not even know they have it. The gorilla walked through the frame the entire time. So did the answer.